Right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Stockholm School of Economics. My name is Lars Strannegård. I am the president here, and it's my great pleasure to just say 30 seconds, I guess, or so, about this Nobel discussion that we're having today. So we have two of the laureates coming here today. It's Simon Johnson and James Robinson. It's a great honor, of course, to have you here. And most of you know quite a bit about this year's prize, which I find extremely interesting, on how institutions are formed and actually affect prosperity, and also sort of tackling the old, really fundamental question of correlation and causality, basically. What comes first in terms of institutions and prosperity. On a personal note, I hope this discussion is going to be on a little bit about the institution of education, actually what the role is of educational institutions like ours. And also schools, how they actually come into play when it comes to the development of countries, etc. Also very interesting is the fact that it's a sort of combination between economics and political science, and of course economic history. We will hear a lot about that. So I think it's wonderful to have you here. We're so honored for that. And this is also a great tradition here at SSE. It's sort of part of the Nobel course of events. So this is the last day. I think you're soon going to collapse after this final sort of ending in a way. And I also think it's absolutely lovely to see this combination of faculty members, of staff, and of course students. You are the most important ones here today, and it's sort of the idea of what SSE is all about. And I am going to leave the floor now. We have our own distinguished Tore Ellingsen, who will lead the discussion. So thereby I am confident that everything is going to be great. So thanks so much. Welcome.
Okay. All right. Anticipations are high. People living in the world's 20% richest countries are 30 times richer than the people living in the world's 20% poorest countries. So why is that so? And what can be done about it? So in 1993, when Douglas North received 1/2 of the Economic Sciences Prize, it was for his arguments that institutions are central to economic prosperity. For example, North had argued that the Glorious Revolution in England, which deprived the crown of some of its political powers, ultimately had benefited not only the population at large, but perhaps even the crown itself. With the help of new theory, empirical methods, and data, you two, together with Doron, took this line of research to a whole new level. Today, we better understand not only why democratization tends to be beneficial, but also why it often fails to take place. Obviously, I'm very curious to hear what you think about the hopes for democracy and prosperity today. But to set the stage, I think we should go back to the mid-1990s, before you published your pioneering work. In our field of economics, colleagues were running cross-country regressions, leaving us all acutely frustrated that correlation was not causation. And then suddenly, there were a couple of papers, one by Hall and Jones and the other by Laporte et al., that made a little headway on that problem. And personally, I immediately decided to revise my lecture notes on the economics of organization and start off with those papers instead. Apparently, you were not equally impressed, or at least not equally satisfied. So could you please just take us through your thinking at that time? If you still remember.
Yes, no, I do. Yes, I do. No, I mean, I think we all shared the sort of frustration that there was when I was a PhD student in the late 1980s. There was this sort of explosion of research on so-called endogenous growth theory that Paul Romer received the Nobel Prize for, and there was a lot of theoretical innovation in that sort of space. But I think we were really interested in these questions, not particularly of what's the steady state rate of growth in the United States, but what can account for these enormous differences around the world. And I think, first of all, Paul's theory doesn't explain that at all, actually. And I think a lot of people were experimenting with these empirical setups where they just looked at these correlational patterns around the world, including with some kind of measures of institutions, Knack and Kiefer and things like that. But many things covary, and it's very difficult to kind of pull apart the role of one variable or one factor from another. And I think Hall and Jones's paper, without getting too much into the weeds, sort of went into the right direction, meaning, okay, we need to think about these sources of variation and try to understand, what explains institutional variation. And so they didn't use institutions, if I remember correctly. Didn't they call it social something?
Social infrastructure.
Social infrastructure. You see, gosh, yes, I haven't read that paper for 30 years. So social infrastructure. And they sort of said, but it's related to institutions and other things. And they started thinking about, how does that vary? But then they didn't come with a theory of that. They sort of looked at correlations and said social infrastructure is better in temperate latitudes, if I remember correctly. Okay, but Jeffrey Sachs was saying, well, countries are intrinsically more they're intrinsically more prosperous in temperate latitudes. So I think Hall and Jones' paper, although it was innovative in many ways, it clearly didn't solve this problem of what was called. They kind of moved in that direction without really getting there. And I think the key for getting there was to take a more theoretical approach. I think when we sort of got into this question of building on Doug North's work, we'd all convinced ourselves, by reading history and from other work that institutions was a big story, there's theoretical mechanisms, and Daron and I, before the three of us started working, had worked a lot on the theory of institutions. We developed all these theoretical models of democratization and democratic consolidation. So I think we'd all come at that from different angles, and we'd all convinced ourselves that that was true. But to kind of crack this bigger inferential problem, or to crack the question of causality, you need to come with a theory. Ultimately, you have to come with a theory of the variation, what creates all this variation in institutions, and Hall and Jones hadn't done that. And I think that was when, in discussion, we sort of started thinking about history, and we came up with this idea that, look, this is to do with colonialism. Colonialism has this huge impact on the institutions in different parts of the world, and then we were able to kind of exploit, theoretically and empirically, the colonial experience as a source of variation, and that helped us to solve the problem that Hall and Jones sort of got, but didn't know how to really approach. Is that reasonable?
Absolutely. I think all three of us, separately and jointly, have been much more motivated in all our work by problems we see in the real world and questions we get from our real world experiences, rather than trying to modify or amend a particular academic literature. So just personally, I worked for 10 years in Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, in the 1990s, trying to be useful, trying to study what was happening at the macroeconomic level, and struggling. And I taught for part of one semester at the Stockholm School of Economics in the mid-1990s, actually. And I was struggling to try and figure out why standard macro was not, it was helpful, but not as helpful as it should be. And I'd begun to write about the corruption underground economy, and in retrospect had moved towards some of these institutional understandings. But when I met Jim and Daron, and I understood their perspective and the theories that they were developing, it was a huge light bulb moment for me. And I thought, I really would like to join this team and see what I can contribute. And I'm a very empirical data type of person, and they're very deep theoretical people. And I think that created a sort of a magic combination, frankly, in retrospect.
Yeah, so it's funny because that anticipated already my next question, because I thought, since there are so many students also in this audience, why don't we spend just a little bit of time on the methods? So how important was it that there had been these developments taking place in game theory for the theorists and in empirical methods concerning causal inference? So you were living in the middle of that, and do you think that the time was more ripe for the kind of research that you wanted to do because of that?
I mean, I think, the theoretical work that we did, yes, it was incredibly useful. There was so much progress in the 1980s in the theory of repeated games and the theory of dynamic games, that we applied to kind of modeling institutional transition and institutional change. And so we'd all learnt those tools, Daron and I had both learnt those tools, in grad school, but applied to kind of, industrial organization or cartel maintenance, or topics that we thought were kind of excruciatingly boring, with all due respect to distinguished scholars of IO in the audience. And we were interested in political economy and struggling to figure out how to kind of do political economy. And of course we benefited enormously from this massive upsurge of work in political economy. Torsten Pearson, Guido Tabellini, Alberto Alessina were the kind of leading scholars that, the late 1980s. But that was really applied to kind of macroeconomic questions and deficit financing, kind of bad policy. But we were not, we are interested in that, but we were interested in this institutional space, very different types of questions that they were interested in. And for that it seemed the different sorts of models were. So I think that was key, and then seeing how to kind of apply those in that space, was it took some time to do it. But yes, that was crucial. Yes, obviously.
So before we go to the empirical methods, so just to follow up on that, but why is game theory important? I remember Thomas Schelling, he refused, he didn't want to be a game theorist. And I claimed when he was there that he was. But it seemed that to him, he thought that he could think about all of these things without the apparatus.
Yeah. Well,
Would you agree with that?
No, you were not clever enough to do that. If you're really clever, you can do that and you can get a conclusion. But if you're not very clever, you have to do the algebra. That's what I always think. Because no, I'm serious. I'm serious. You have to, because you miss things if you just. He was a very brilliant man. I didn't know him well, but he was a very brilliant man. But it's a different. We were more pens and paper and algebra kind of people. And I, for me, when we got interested in this topic, Daron and I got interested in this issue of democratization, and early on, and so we started reading all these history books about democratization and the issues. And for us, it just seemed like these game theoretic questions came up all the time. The question of credibility, and it just jumps out of the history books. They're written, by historians who didn't know anything about game theory or economics. So for us, it was just such a natural application of these tools.
Yeah, and so you would say that to you the models speak back. It's not just take your intuition and then articulate it in this mathematical language to make it look prettier?
No. Yeah.
It speaks back.
Because, so for example, let me give you, I can remember this very well. So when the first model of democratization we worked on, we had this, there's an autocracy and there's a democracy, and people have different preferences over these different institutions, and then we're trying to understand how you get these dynamics. How do you get these transitions? And then we came up with a theoretical problem, which was, an autocracy can mimic anything that democracy can do. So how do you ever get democratization? Because the autocracy is just going to... So we had a model of revolutions and, but okay, you can threaten the revolution, fine, let me give you this, and then you go away, So we were like, oh, gosh, okay. So that was the result. And the paper, we thought, okay, that's not, so what, that So then we went back to like reading books and sort of looking at some of these historical case studies and trying to understand, okay, so that seems like a really compelling logic in the theory, but somehow we're missing something here. And that's when we came up with this idea that, oh yes, this transitory aspect of it that's absolutely crucial to understanding. Like today you may be organized, you may be beating the gates down, but that's very difficult to sustain collective action. And that's crucial for understanding these transitions. And I think that was really just looking at the theory, there's problems with the theory, going back to the evidence, coming so there's a sort of dialectical process there, but I think the theory, that's guided by the theory, and then it informs the theory, and yeah.
Right. So, students, you listened. So, this is one of the things you learn in the first term here, that the point of the formalization is to help you think. And then when you've been thinking enough, well, then if you're fortunate and really good, you can translate back and explain in ordinary words. And I think that's been amply demonstrated by you and Doron. I mean, in some of your books too. There was not a single formula, if I remember right, in Why Nations Fail.
No formulas, no footnotes. Yeah.
So there you go. Then you become so clever you can translate it back.
Yes, or it's so trivial. Yes, I know. I mean, that book was written to I mean, one of the reasons we wrote that book, we should let Simon talk about the empirical methods, but one of the reasons we wrote that book was, Daron and I, all of us, we read all these history books, and so we'd write these theoretical papers, and there'd be all of the empirical section with these case studies and stuff, and then every editor in an economics journal would be, delete that, section 2, delete that, get rid of that, who cares, So we thought, gosh, we've been so inspired by these historical examples and these case studies. Maybe we should write them up, because maybe if we were inspired, other people would be inspired too.
And that brings us then to the empirics, because it's all good and well to be able to provide these nice theorems, but they're completely different things to check whether they're actually true. So how did you get at that?
Well, I think just to sort of step back for a moment, and you never quite understand where you are and what's going on around you. But in retrospect, in the mid-1990s, there was a lot of the bar on trying to establish causation was raised, including at MIT. I mean, to me, a lot of it runs through Josh Angrist, who received his Nobel Prize, I think, 2014. Or perhaps that was Bengt Holmström. There's so many of them. And also, of course, Esther Duflo, Abhijit Banerjee, and Michael Kramer were doing very important work establishing causation in interventions, for example, in developing countries. And they obviously won a Nobel Prize also. And I think what we felt we were doing was trying to bring those same high standards and that same care, but instead of bringing it to relatively controlled, quasi-experimental intervention type settings, we were trying to apply it to all of human history, which, was a different kind of ambition and perhaps a little foolish. But it also felt, like a pretty fair and open challenge. And we understood you need to find an instrumental variable that needed to really work. It needed to have some influence on early institutions. There had to be some plausible story and data supporting the idea that institutions persisted, and it had to be excludable from the second stage regression, which is absolutely critical. And I think the initial, when I look back on the papers we wrote, we spent 3 or 4 or 5 years on the initial set of papers, and then 5 to 10 years defending those results and arguing with people. And I think because we were very focused and tried to be very honest with ourselves and with our audiences at the beginning and totally transparent. My only regret in that initial paper, Richard remembers this, is we had an additional table of robustness results, talking about what editors make you take out. I think it was table 5 in the MBR working paper. You can check it online now, which had some additional robustness checks on smaller samples, where we could say, look, here's this data we're really sure about. You see, it works for this very small set of countries, and then we expanded it. to this core sample, and the editors of the AR, who were incredibly nice to us, made us take that table out. And what are you going to say, right? You're not going to say, well, no, I refuse. You say, well, yes, please. I've always regretted that, because a number of critiques that emerged afterwards would not have had a leg to stand on if people had read that table. And then, I remember saying to at least one of our critics, go read the MBR working paper. We already answered this. But because it wasn't in the published version, it somehow didn't have that same traction. But anyway, I think just being honest, being focused on trying to establish causation and trying to follow the data was I think, a big part of why this has been successful.
Right. So this data on settler mortality and so on, you think that you went all the way to do that partly because of the raised bar?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I don't think we had any interest in just running correlations. I think that there was plenty of that out there. And we were, I think, again, separately and jointly, all super interested in history, like history from hundreds of years ago.
Yeah.
And so we were really thinking and believing there was some causal story out there, but we didn't know exactly what it was, and we didn't know what the instrument would be until we started to investigate.
Of course, since then, there's been such an avalanche of follow-up research by yourself and by others. Which of those subsequent findings surprised you the most? Or were you ever surprised? Always.
I liked writing these papers. I really liked working with Jim and Ron. It was very creative and fun. And I think we wrote 20 papers or something on these topics, and then went on to pursue various other lines that are closely related. But I remember, let's be totally honest, we do look at ourselves on Google Scholar probably pretty much every hour. Like most people. But I remember seeing some work by Lakshmi Iyer early on, writing about India and land tenure systems. And particularly, I felt that Lakshmi was addressing this issue of why don't extractive institutions fade away? This question of why does this legacy last quite strongly for hundreds of years? And I thought Lakshmi was really getting at that. And then Melissa Dell did her work on the silver mining, the Mita. And I thought, wow, I wish I'd written that paper. But I realized that she was using or inspired by what we'd done. And I think because we did this broad cross-country work, and we had to use a measures of institutions, both current and historical, that are somewhat high level because you need something that compares across countries. What Lakshmi and Melissa did was show you, the really deep texture of kind of what lay behind that, with really good empirical methods. And I think that was, when I read their papers, I was utterly convinced by their work, which kind of had a nice spillover effect back to our work.
I think the secret of the success of that work actually was exactly this sort of agenda. If you think about many of these people who've written papers are kind of, loosely, I don't want to claim too much credit, but apparently loosely inspired by what we did. It's because we sort of laid out this historical variation in institutions and colonialism, and and then you see, well, there's many things going on with colonialism. There's many mechanisms, there's many ways it influences, like, Melissa's work looking at extractive institutions in Peru, and Nathan Nunn's work in Africa looking at the slave trade and the legacy of slavery. So I think that's been so exciting and rewarding to kind of draw a lot of young people into that topic and get them thinking about the richness and complexity of it. If there's one thing that I would say sort of surprised me, which I found very interesting, is, if you look within the United States, you kind of think, okay, you got the north of the US, the south of the US. The south had slavery. The south was poorer, less industrialized, had less manufacturing industry, fewer public goods, less infrastructure. So the slave economy was poorer. Extractive economy, poorer, more inclusive in the north, richer. Okay, great. But it turns out if you look at Latin America, it's actually much more subtle than that. So if you look, for example, within Latin American countries, if I worked at the national level, I'd say North America, okay, the South, yeah, but North America, on average, more inclusive than Latin America. Let's say Colombia. Okay, but if I look And I can say, at the national level, sure, Colombia is more extractive than the United States. But if I look within Colombia and I ask myself, is it true within Colombia the places with the more extractive institutions are poorer than the places with less extractive, more inclusive institutions, which is what you see in the US? It turns out not to be true. In fact, in most Latin American countries, you don't really see that. So in Colombia, if I took the meter, the equivalent to the meter, there were mining meters in Colombia, but small ones. But the equivalent to the meter would be the encomienda, like say the encomienda. So the encomienda was this institution whereby indigenous people were kind of granted to Spaniards to exploit, basically, without putting, going into too much detail, exploit. Okay, so you might think the places where the encomienda was more intense, there's more exploitation, should be poorer, like the US. Turns out the opposite's true, actually. If you look within Colombia, this is true more generally in Latin America, places with the encomienda are actually poorer, actually richer than places without the encomienda. So there's sort of there's confounding factors, and that's kind of hard to unpack, the confounding factors, like in Melissa finds the elite areas, the non-meter elite areas do kind of better because the elites hold the resources and they, so I think there's actually, I feel like I'm in the weeds too much here, but there's actually a lot of puzzles at that level, actually, thinking about within country variation and just how these extractive institutions work and the mechanisms and
yeah, and I guess that's related to this question, are there exceptions to your theory? I mean, are there cases where you would say, no, democracy isn't that great? So some people have been pointing to Singapore, for example, and look, they've been successful. So how do you address that?
So I think that this language of inclusive and extractive institutions, which was not the language we had in the initial paper, it's language that Dron and Jim developed subsequently. But I think it really fits well and it really helps explain a lot of this, which is you can in principle have inclusion without a lot of democracy, in principle. And perhaps that's what Singapore has done, although if there's anyone here from Singapore, they'll probably stand up and give me a lecture on Singapore democracy. That's what usually happens in my classrooms. But I think that turns out to be very difficult to pull off, because it's just far too easy when you don't have democracy for a few people to take advantage of the system and pull it in their direction and make it into something that's extractive. But I think that the key for economic prosperity really is, do a lot of people have opportunity? Do a lot of people have rights? Are a lot of people empowered economically? Can they start a business without being subject to corruption? And that is supported by democracy and reinforced by democracy, and typically when you have that, and I think this is the history of Western Europe and also what we've seen in some other cases, the rising middle class wants more democracy. I'm from the north of England. My family ran a small business for 100 years, and they had no vote in the early 19th century. No one who lived in Sheffield had a vote. And so that asking to expand the franchise across those industrial cities was a very natural step. And I think my wife's family is from, her parents were born in South Korea. My wife was born in the United States. And the history of South Korea, which has been not an exception to the point about democracy, but it has been exceptional in terms of starting with a lot of poverty and very weak or extractive even institutions in the 1950s. They have built both a robust democracy and inclusive economic institutions. So I think that these things are typically reinforcing, but sure, there are exceptions. I mean, my favorite review of any of our work actually was a review that Jared Diamond did of Why Nations Fail by Dron and Jim in the New York Review of Books, where after quibbling about various details, he said, well, I guess in the end, we could say that institutions explain 50% of the variation in GDP per capita around the world. 50%. I mean, we never claim more. The highest R squared in our regressions is 70%, 0.7. So if he's willing to, if one of our most informed critics is willing to give us 50%, I'm just going to say yes and walk away.
So that's great. So that brings us to the question that we were heading towards all along then. So the burning question today, why is democracy under such great threat? I mean, it's so good. as you've argued. And so why is it under such great threat, and what can we do to strengthen it?
Well, let me have a go at that. We may have different opinions, but I mean, I think, or maybe we don't. Yeah, I mean, I think what's difficult to see, is you can tell a sort of you could tell an idiosyncratic story for every country. I could tell a story for the Philippines, and I could tell a story for, Brazil. I could tell a story, but there's something kind of global going on, And so I think, what we've seen in the past are these kind of waves of democracy. Democracy waxes and wanes, and sometimes it meets challenges. And it meets challenges when it can't deal with the problems. If you thought about an extreme case, which is the collapse of Weimar democracy, in some sense, Weimar democracy collapsed because it just was trapped in gridlock, and it couldn't deal with the problems, and it just couldn't deliver policies, and it couldn't deliver things that really could cope with the shocks that were hitting it. And I think you could say, I mean, if you look at Simon and Daron's book, their most recent book, they document very conclusively, yes, available to all good book retailers.
No, actually, I bought all the copies available in Sweden, actually, and some are in the front row too.
So forget the bookshops, but there's Amazon. Okay, so democracy has not been delivering in the United States for the last 50 years, except for people at the top, except for people like us. For ordinary working class people, democracy's not been delivering anything. Living standards have not improved. Social mobility has slowed down, according to Raj Chetty's work. So democracy's not delivering, and it has the same problem, which is the world is changing, there's globalization, there's technical change, and there's, and democracy hasn't generated the policies that can cope with that. So I think there's and I could tell, again, you could sort of say, okay, what's that got to do with the Philippines? Well, there was a wave of democratization, in the world in the 1980s. Samuel Huntington's so-called third wave of democracy that does connect the Philippines to Mexico, to other parts of the world. And I think democracy created so many expectations that it was going to be transformative, and it was going to, and it didn't. It didn't transform people's lives in the Philippines. It was clientelistic, it was corrupt, it didn't generate public goods. And I think there's a global disillusionment in some sense with the idea of democracy as being something transformative, and it's kind of hit a snag, and it needs to somehow reinvent itself. I mean, there are institutional initiatives, in France or Ireland and Iceland, trying to get people more involved and trying to find a way of making democracy look like it's more attentive to what people care about. And I think the evidence, I don't think we know how effective those things are yet. But I would say, that's the problem, that democracy has not been transformative in the way that people wanted. The people are disillusioned and they're looking for something else. Yeah.
And so my rule for myself is that whenever a student asks me a question or emails me a question that I can answer, but only by reference to one of my books, I give them the book. So there you go. So I think the short answer, very much in line with what Jim said, is if you failed, the democracies have not done well. Some democracies, including the United States, and Sweden may well be one of the exceptions to this, but the United States has not done well in terms of delivering shared prosperity over the past 40 years. So the real weekly earnings of people with a lot of education, which hopefully most of you will go on to be, have risen quite nicely over 40 years. The middle class has done okay, but a lot of people got kicked out of the middle class by automation, globalization, decline of trade unions. And real weekly earnings for men have barely increased since the 1960s in the United States. And then you look at all the progress and the change around you and all the new technology, and you say, well, what's in it for me? And who's gained? Some of these elites, right? And so the story is really interesting. The narrative, I mean, Donald Trump, hopefully you have a series of questions about Donald Trump to ask. I always look forward to those. But the Trump phenomenon, or the rhetoric of the Trump, the MAGA wing, the Make America Great Again wing of the Trump coalition, is all about criticizing elites, right? And saying that the elites have extracted the value from America. And when they say Make America Great Again, what they're saying, and this is, by the way, a complete smoke and mirrors illusion, and it's wrong and false, and the policies will lead you to despair and into the abyss, just to be clear on my views on that. But the rhetoric is very clever, and what the rhetoric is saying is they want to go back to this period when there was shared prosperity, before these, what they regard as the illegitimate elites, took over the system and ruined it. And I think that I think Trump is a very good marketer at some level, and they understand, and people understand that it was better in the post-war decades for various reasons, and it has slipped, that shared prosperity has slipped away from being a top priority or being something that we delivered on more or less effortlessly in the post-war period in the United States, and that plays out in different ways in different places. And if you overlay the arrival of artificial intelligence on top of that, and the power of people like Elon Musk at this moment, we think there are choices, we think there's agency, we think there's plenty that can be done about it, including in Sweden, including the United States. But there are powerful forces that are unequalizing in terms of outcomes. And if those forces get what they want, including the populist policies that Mr. Trump will pursue, that makes it much harder to hold on to real, genuine, vibrant democracy.
Right. But, I mean, we have 5 minutes left. That means that there is some time for you also to lay out what you think are the most important policies that could save democracy then, even in a country like the US.
Oh, 5 minutes is a lot of time for that, yeah. I mean...
So I do understand you want everyone to read the book instead, but...
Oh, that's a good idea. It hadn't occurred to me. Yes, why don't you do that? Once they restock the Swedish bookstores, which... So go ahead, you go first.
No, I mean, I think Simon is much better on this than I am. I mentioned some of those initiatives. I mean, what sort of struck me about the United States in the last 4 years is the extent to which the Democratic Party just don't get it. Like President Biden, despite those facts that Simon just laid out, which are sort of everyone agrees on, President Biden spends enormous amounts of resources for giving loans for people who went to college, but they're the winners. So he's delivering enormous handouts to the winners. Now, I don't know if maybe there's an argument for that or whatever, some kind of economic argument or, whatever, but the politics of it is absolutely nuts, completely baffling to me. And so I think there's a sort of lack of understanding of these problems which has massively facilitated the rise of Donald Trump. So maybe the first thing that one could do is kind of wake up to the nature of the problem. As this outlined sort of brilliantly in their book, is just wake up to the nature of the problem and try to figure out what are effective policies to do something about it, and I don't think this is about the Electoral College or whatever. No, this is what policies can address some of these problems, what policies can create opportunities and real jobs and social mobility and kind of restore, but it's not this, again, we're talking about the US, but this is a problem in many other places also. How do you restore the faith in democracy in many other parts of the world? And so that's I mean, I think the research, I don't think we maybe people here know what the answer to that. I'm not sure I kind of had a go at it, but I'm not really sure we understand this commonality and
So Dron and I and David Autor, a colleague at MIT, have a research group that is focused on developing what we call pro-worker AI. And the point is that artificial intelligence can either be a technology that really benefits highly educated people and owners of capital, or it could be a technology that enhances the productivity of people with less education. And if you raise that productivity in the right social framework, you can also hopefully raise their pay and hopefully restore some of these middle-class opportunities. Now, the natural tendency of this technology, as far as we can see right now, is to be unequalizing and to put a lot more power in the hands of a few people. So it is an uphill struggle, or perhaps even a forlorn hope, to try and change the path of technology in a way that would create more opportunities for more people, particularly people without a lot of education. But if you don't do that and just say, well, we'll let the market do its thing and then redistribute, That might work in Sweden, but it doesn't work in the United States. We don't get the redistribution. And also, once you let the powerful people, the new powerful people, become powerful and exercise that power through politics, you get exactly what we're seeing with the Elon Musk phenomenon, which is, I think he calls himself the first buddy, right? And he put millions of dollars into the election campaign, and he made billions of dollars in terms of increased asset value when Mr. Trump was declared the winner. So many people are going to study that lesson, and I think the US will become more oligarchic, not less, unless we find a different way to develop technology. And I think there are historical episodes, mostly on pages 57 and 93, that we can draw on. And you know, I think these societies, these rich industrial democracies, have a capacity and an ability to reimagine what drives the future and to find different ways to tap into our engineering talent, to use the resources of universities, to link economics, engineering, and science. Is it a lot of work? Sure. Is it difficult? Absolutely. Is it any harder than winning the Nobel Prize in economics? We'll find out.
Can I just say something here?
Yes, you can.
You know, I think at the end of the Nobel banquet, there were 3 speeches. I think it's very interesting. I think these are printed and available. Like for me, one of the lessons that I learned this week, hanging out with these physicists and chemists and all these people who are kind of working on AI, is there's such a crucial role here for economists and social scientists. It seems like there's 2 sorts of natural scientists. There's one sort of natural scientists who think that basically in 10 years we'll all be living in the Matrix with Keanu Reeves. And robots will be running everything, and we'll be like hiding underground, from the robots who are looking for us. And they're just like, it's a new phase of human evolution. First there was pond slime, and then pond slime became humans, and then humans created robots, and then the robots replaced humans, and it's all evolution, and what's not to like about evolution, So that's one sort of physicist, and then the other sort is like, well, humans can't make toast, so we invented the toaster, and humans can't fly, so we invented the airplane, and now we have AI. What's not to like about the toaster, airplanes, and AI? So there's these 2. There's no incentives. There's no institutions. There's social science has a lot to contribute here.
Oh, on that happy note. So, we will soon move down, but first I think we will listen to the president of the Students' Association. The floor is yours.
What a great ending to hear that we have an important play in society in the future for all our economic students. My name is Clara, and I'm the president of the Student Association. And on behalf of the Student Association and the students here at Stockholm School of Economics, I would like to extend my sincerest gratitude to you for coming here to our school and sharing your knowledge with us. The prize that you have received is an acknowledgement probably greater than any other. And for us, it is an opportunity to be inspired, just as you have talked about today. So on behalf of the Student Association, I would like to thank you for your time and commitment to your research and for the inspiration that you give to us. And as a small token of appreciation, I would like to invite 2 of my board members to come up on stage and present some gifts that we will give you.
Okay. Yeah, standing up. Yeah.
Thanks, sir.
So, first, I would like to give you the Student Association standard. Do you hear me? Should I speak louder? Yes, so you will be the 85th and 82nd recipient of this standard in our Student Association's 115th history. And all the pretty. And then it comes to the purple overall. You have a mic. Thank you. To the purple overall. This one we wear all the time. And I can promise you that you will get the student spirit when you wear these. Everything becomes a little bit more fun. Exactly. So as you see, it also says Nobel laureate on the back, which is kind of cool. Yeah. And there's one important part about the purple overall, and that is that you are not allowed to wash it, ever. Because all the stains and all the dirt is a symbol of memories, and those we do not want to wash away. And, oh, thank you, pretty. And to the last gift that we have for you. You have received the Sveriges Riksbank Prize in Economic Science in memory of Alfred Nobel. And that is worth celebrating. And we think that you should celebrate this in the absolute best possible way with our SSE punch. And on the punch, do you want to read what it says on the label? I can read it for you if you want. But
I put my glasses on. Take a sip for history and a glass for the future.
Exactly. So this you drink at the end of your dinners to the dessert or after the dessert.
I thought it was a bottle of, to celebrate Alfred Nobel, it was a bottle of nitroglycerin.
Yes, and we hope you will enjoy it. So once again, thank you for coming here to our school, and a warm congratulations on your achievements.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.